The church stood silent in the fading afternoon light, its wooden pews arranged in perfect rows like witnesses to countless vows spoken and promises made. Dust motes danced through the stained glass windows, painting the worn floorboards in shades of amber and rose. Jake Sullivan stood at the altar, his hands clasped behind his back, his jaw set in that familiar stubborn line that had gotten him through cattle drives, harsh winters, and more lonely nights than he cared to count. He wasn't supposed to be here. Not like this. Not alone. The preacher, Reverend Morrison, shifted uncomfortably beside him, clearing his throat for the third time in as many minutes. The small gathering of townspeople who had come to witness what they thought would be a wedding sat in awkward silence, their whispers creating a soft rustling sound like wind through dry grass. Jake could feel their eyes on his back, could sense their pity mixing with curiosity, and it made his skin crawl worse than any scorpion ever had. 3 hours. That's how long he'd been waiting. 3 hours since the ceremony was supposed to start, since Margaret Henderson was supposed to walk down that aisle in her mother's wedding dress, since his life was supposed to change in all the ways he'd planned so carefully. Margaret, with her practical nature and her father's ranch bordering his own. Margaret, who made sense on paper, who fit into his life like a missing fence post finally hammered into place. But Margaret hadn't shown up. Instead, her younger sister had arrived an hour ago with a tear-stained face and a crumpled letter, explaining that Margaret had taken the morning train to Denver with the banker's son. The same banker's son Jake had warned her about, the smooth-talking city boy who had been sniffing around town for the past 6 months with his fancy suits and his promises of a different life. Jake should have left then. Should have walked out of that church with whatever dignity he had remaining, gone back to his ranch, and buried himself in work the way he always did when life threw him from the saddle. But something had kept him rooted to that spot. Pride, maybe. Or stubbornness. Or perhaps just the simple fact that he'd made a promise to be at that altar, and Jake Sullivan kept his promises, even when others didn't keep theirs. The afternoon shadows were growing longer now, stretching across the church floor like dark fingers reaching for something just out of grasp. Reverend Morrison leaned closer, his voice gentle. "Son, I think maybe it's time." The church door swung open. Every head turned. The whispers stopped as suddenly as if someone had thrown a blanket over them. And there, silhouetted against the golden light of the dying day, stood a woman Jake had never seen before in his life. She wasn't dressed for a wedding. She wore dusty traveling clothes, a blue shirt that had seen better days, dark pants that were more practical than proper, and boots that had clearly walked a long road. Her copper-red hair was wind-blown and wild, escaping from a loose braid that fell over one shoulder. But it was her eyes that caught him, even from that distance. Eyes the color of a storm rolling in over the mountains, wide with something that looked like desperation mixed with determination. She stood there for a long moment, her chest rising and falling like she'd been running. Her gaze swept the church, taking in the decorated pews, the waiting congregation, the preacher in his formal robes. And then her eyes landed on Jake, and something passed between them in that moment, something he couldn't name but felt all the way down to his bones. She walked down the aisle. Not slowly, not with the measured steps of a bride making her entrance. She walked with purpose, her boots echoing on the wooden floor, her eyes never leaving his face. The congregation erupted in confused murmurs, but Jake barely heard them. He was too busy trying to understand what was happening, too busy noticing the way her hands trembled slightly even as she held her chin high, too busy wondering why his heart was suddenly beating faster than it had any right to. She stopped in front of him, close enough that he could see the freckles scattered across her nose, close enough to notice the small cut on her lower lip, close enough to smell the dust and sage in something else, something like desperation and hope mixed together. "I'm sorry I'm late," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but steady somehow. "I got here as fast as I could." Jake stared at her, his mind racing to catch up with what was happening. "Ma'am, I think there's been some mistake. Please." The word came out sharp, almost breaking. Her hand reached out and gripped his forearm, and he could feel the urgency in her touch. "Please, just listen. I need to get married today. Right now. And you're the only man standing at an altar within 100 miles. Behind them, the whispers exploded into full conversation. Reverend Morrison sputtered something about propriety and proper procedure. But Jake found himself unable to look away from this strange woman's face, unable to ignore the fear he saw swimming beneath her brave exterior. "Why?" he asked simply. She glanced over her shoulder at the church doors, and Jake saw it then, the real fear, the kind that came from being hunted. When she looked back at him, her eyes were pleading. "Because there are 3 men on horses about an hour behind me, and if they catch me before I'm legally married, they're going to drag me back to a man who has no right to call me his. Because my stepfather sold me like I was cattle to settle a gambling debt. Because I've been riding for 3 days straight, and this is the first church I've found, and you're the first man I've seen standing at an altar looking like maybe you understand what it's like when life doesn't go according to plan." The church had gone silent again. Everyone was leaning forward now, caught up in the drama unfolding before them. Jake studied her face, looking for signs of deception, looking for anything that would tell him this was some kind of trick or scheme. But all he saw was a woman at the end of her rope, making one last desperate grab for freedom. He thought about Margaret, probably sitting in a fancy Denver restaurant right now, laughing with her banker's son. He thought about his empty ranch house, about the plans he'd made that had crumbled like dust. He thought about how he'd told himself he was marrying Margaret because it made sense, because it was practical, because it fit into the life he'd built. But standing here now, looking at this wild-haired stranger with storm cloud eyes who had literally run to an altar to save herself, Jake realized that maybe sense and practicality had never been what he really wanted anyway. "What's your name?" he asked. "Copper. Copper McAllister." She said it like she was offering him something precious, something real. "I'm Jake Sullivan." He held out his hand, formal and proper despite the absolutely insane circumstances. She took it, and her grip was strong, calloused, the grip of someone who knew hard work. "And I've got one question before we do this." She nodded, waiting. "Can you ride?" A smile broke across her face then, the first real smile he'd seen from her, and it transformed everything. "Better than most men." "Can you shoot?" "Never missed a target I aimed at." "Can you work from sunup to sundown without complaining?" "Done it every day of my life." Jake nodded slowly, a strange calm settling over him. This was crazy. This was absolutely insane. He was standing at an altar about to marry a complete stranger because she'd asked him to, because she needed saving, because something in her eyes called to something in him that he hadn't even known was listening. He turned to Reverend Morrison, whose face had gone pale. "Reverend, I believe we have a wedding to perform." "But Jake, you don't even know this woman. This is highly irregular." "So was getting stood up at my own wedding," Jake interrupted, his voice carrying that edge of authority that came from years of running his own ranch. "But I'm here, she's here, and if I remember correctly, the only requirements for a legal marriage in this territory are 2 willing parties and an ordained minister. We've got all 3. Kappa's hand tightened on his arm, and when he looked down at her, he saw gratitude mixed with something else. Respect, maybe, or the beginning of trust. The ceremony was quick, perfunctory. Reverend Morrison stumbled through the words, clearly uncomfortable with the whole situation. The congregation sat in stunned silence, some scandalized, others leaning forward with barely concealed excitement at the gossip this would generate. Jake barely heard the words. He was too aware of Copper standing beside him, of the way she held herself together even though he could see the exhaustion pulling at her edges, of the moment when he had to slip his mother's ring, the one he'd retrieved from Margaret's sister, onto her finger. When Reverend Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, there was no kiss. Just a long look between them, an acknowledgement of the strange bargain they'd just struck. And then the church doors burst open again. 3 men stood there, dust-covered and mean-looking, their hands resting on the guns at their hips. The one in front, a heavy-set man with cold eyes, stepped forward. "That's far enough. The girl belongs to Silas Crane. She's got no right running off like this." Jake felt Copper stiffen beside him, felt her start to pull away like she was preparing to run or fight. He caught her hand, held it firm, and stepped forward to face the men. "The girl," he said, his voice carrying through the church like a judge's verdict, "is now my wife, married legal and proper in front of a preacher and 30 witnesses. Which means she doesn't belong to anyone but herself, and she's chosen to be here with me." The heavy-set man's face darkened. "Silas ain't gonna like this." Then Silas can come talk to me about it himself. Jake's hand moved to rest on his own gun, a casual gesture that carried unmistakable meaning. But he'll find I'm not as easy to push around as a young woman traveling alone. Now get out of this church before you disrespect it further. The three men exchanged glances. They were hired muscle, not gunfighters, and Jake could see them calculating the odds. 1 man against 3 might have been manageable, but not with a church full of witnesses and not when that 1 man had the law on his side. After a tense moment, they backed out, though their final looks promised this wasn't over. When the doors closed behind them, Jake felt copper sag slightly against his side. He turned to face her, this stranger who was now his wife, and saw tears tracking through the dust on her cheeks even as she smiled up at him. "Thank you," she whispered. "You didn't have to do that." Jake looked at her, really looked at her, and realized that maybe Margaret leaving had been the best thing that could have happened to him. Maybe all his careful plans had needed to fall apart to make room for something better. Something real, something that walked into a church covered in trail dust and fear and courage in equal measure. "Come on, Mrs. Sullivan," he said, offering her his arm. "Let's go home." And as they walked down that aisle together, past the stunned faces and whispered exclamations, Jake Sullivan felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt like his life was finally beginning, like all the lonely years and careful plans had been leading him to this exact moment, to this exact woman. The cowboy who had waited at the altar alone had found something worth more than all the practical arrangements in the world. He'd found someone who had chosen him, not for his land or his name, but because she needed him. And he'd chosen her back, not knowing anything except that sometimes the best things in life are the ones you never planned for at all.